as we're approaching a pivotal election this year, I wanted to look back at some past elections, and particularly now the election of 1800, when Thomas Jefferson defeated John Adams and became the president. After the American Revolution, there was a consensus that the leaders of the revolution would be the leaders of the new government. And as a result, Washington was elected president by acclamation, unopposed, re-elected unopposed, and John Adams, who really was the person who carried independence mainly in the Continental Congress, became the vice president, finishing second to Washington and becoming the vice president. But in the election of 1796, after Washington left, partisan politics began to assert itself in the United States, and a sharp division emerged between the revolutionary leaders, typified by Adams, Hamilton, and basically Washington, who were Federalists, and Jefferson, Madison, who were Republicans. And increasingly, the division was over foreign policy. The Federalists admiring Britain and wanting us to be more British-oriented, and the Republicans allying with France in what was then the World War of Britain against France because of our historic relationship with France and out of sympathy for what was, at least initially, their democratic experiment before Napoleon took over. In domestic politics, they really represented the patricians and the plebeians of ancient Rome, the two classical political parties from the days of Cicero, where plebeians were the average people and patricians were the aristocracy, and each had a party. And truly at that point the Federalists were the patricians and the Republicans the plebeians. That was an era when there was a property requirement to be able to vote. There was not universal white male suffrage, but only universal white male wealthy suffrage. And a real question as to whether the U.S. government would become really more monarchical and more British in nature than the democracy it ultimately became. These controversies sharpened to a fever pitch in 1798 when Adams and the Federalist Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts that muzzled free speech and resulted in the imprisonment of pro-Jefferson editors, publishers, and even one congressman, Matthew Lyon of Vermont. And this triggered a horrific debate in which also the Republicans began to speak about the ability of states to nullify federal legislation and pass the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, drafted in secret by Jefferson and Madison, that asserted the right of nullification, which ultimately led to South Carolina asserting it, and ultimately to the secession and the Civil War. All this came to a head in the election of 1800. And the real question was, if Jefferson won, would there be a peaceful transition in power? Or would there be a Federalist attempt at a coup d'etat? A coup was a real possibility because of the threat of war with France as a result of France going after American naval vessels that were trading with Britain. Alexander Hamilton got the Congress to vote money for a standing army, which we'd never had before. And George Washington was the nominal commander, but he was not physically well enough to be the commander. He died in 1799, and Hamilton became the de facto commander. There was a real chance that Hamilton might lead a coup d'etat if Jefferson were elected. Well, the election proceeded. Next week's history video, we'll talk about the mechanics of how Jefferson won the election, one of the most fascinating stories in history. And then Jefferson took office and initiated wholesale changes, replaced large numbers of federal judges, and completely reversed the course of the government. But in his inaugural speech, he said, "We are all Federalists, we are all Republicans." And what was significant about it was not what he changed, but what he did not change. Jefferson continued our form of government. He attempted no fundamental structural reforms that could alienate the Federalists. He stayed studiously within the bounds of the Constitution, except in 1803 when he annexed Louisiana, and reassured the Federalists. And the result was that this democracy had a peaceful transition of power from one party to the other, something most other countries have failed to do. Now, if you click on the link attached to this video, you can hear my podcast, which is a full description of this race and really goes into depth on the race and drills down on the Democratic side of it. So much more than I can do in these short videos. So please click on the link attached to this video or go to iTunes or to podcast1.com. Thanks for watching and listening.